Ready to dive into some serious legal waters.
Let's do it.
We're tackling Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission.
Ah, Citizens United. It's a case that just keeps on giving, right?
It's everywhere, still making headlines, still sparking debate. But why? Why should this one Supreme Court case from, 2010, still matter to us today?
Well, at its core, Citizens United is about this fundamental clash between free speech and, well, let's call it the power to the purse, especially in the world of politics.
Right, because it's not just about some dry legal arguments. It's about how much influence money should have in our elections.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating about Citizens United is how it all started with a movie.
A movie. Okay, now you've got my attention.
It's true. It all goes back to the 2008 presidential election. Picture this. The race is heating up, and you've got Citizens United, which is this conservative group.
Right.
They produced this film called Hillary, the movie. Think of it less as a campaign ad and more like a documentary, but one that's pretty critical of Hillary Clinton, who was running for president at the time.
Okay, so we've got a political documentary right in the thick of a heated election. What could go wrong, right?
Right, and this is where things get interesting. So Citizens United wants to make this film available on demand. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's 2008. People are watching movies online.
You'd think so. But they ran smack into this law called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. It's often just called BCRA for short.
Catchier, for sure.
Right. And this law, it put limits on how much corporations and unions could spend on what are called electioneering communications close to elections.
Electioneering communications. Okay, you know you've wandered into legal jargon territory when you need a dictionary to understand the law.
But it's a mouthful. I'll grant you that. Basically, it means any communication like a PV ad, a flyer, a website, or in this case, even a film that's available online, if it's specifically there to support or oppose a candidate for federal office.
So any kind of message, any medium, as long as it has that clear vote for or vote against message in the lead up to an election, that's what BCRA was trying to regulate.
Exactly. The idea was to keep those final weeks before an election from being completely drowned out by big money trying to sway voters.
Makes sense. You want voters to hear from the candidates themselves, hear about the issues, not just be bombarded by attack ads or glowing endorsements, especially if those messages are coming from groups with tons of money to throw around.
Right. So that's the question at the heart of this whole Citizens United case. Can the government tell a corporation or a union what they can and can't say about a candidate, especially as we get closer to an election?
And the thing is, it's not like the Supreme Court was starting with a blank slate on this issue, right? They had to consider their own past rulings on money and politics.
Oh, absolutely. It's like they had this whole library of Supreme Court drama already on the shelves, and they had to figure out how Citizens United fit into the story.
So what were some of the big cases they had to consider?
Well, you've got Buckley v. Vallejo back in 1976.
Buckley v. Vallejo. Ringing a bell, but remind me.
This was a landmark case. And it basically said that we can put some limits on direct contributions to candidates' campaigns. You know, you can't just show up with a suitcase full of cash and say, here's $1 million, make sure my guy wins. That's a no-go.
Yeah, makes sense. You don't want elections turning into some kind of bidding war.
Exactly. Those are called contribution limits. But here's where it gets interesting. Buckley v. Vallejo also said that limiting how much individuals could spend independently to get their political message out there, that was a step too far.
So the government can say you can't give a candidate $1 million directly, but they can't say you can only spend this much of your own money to support them.
That's the gist of it. The court said that spending your own money to express your political views, even if it means supporting or opposing a candidate, that's protected speech.
So some guardrails around campaign money are okay, but trying to build a whole fortress, not so much.
Right. And then fast forward to 1978 and the case of First National Bank of Boston v. Bellotti.
Okay, Bellotti. What's the key takeaway there?
This one was huge because it was the first time the court gave First Amendment protection to corporations when it comes to political speech.
So corporations have a voice in the public square.
That was the argument, and the court agreed. They said, look, corporations are made up of people, and people have free speech rights, so corporations should too. At least when it comes to speaking out on matters of public concern, like whether a certain law should be passed or not, that's protected speech.
Makes sense. I mean, if an issue affects the corporations, employees, customers, you name it, they should be able to speak out about it.
Right. But there's a catch.
There's always a catch.
Right. This is the Supreme Court we're talking about. So Bellotti was about corporations weighing in on general issues, broad public policy stuff, not necessarily about them jumping into the ring of candidate elections.
Okay, so there's a distinction there between speaking out on, say, tax policy versus saying vote for Smith or don't vote for Jones.
Exactly. It's a subtle but important distinction, and one that would come into play big time with Citizens United.
So we've got Buckley setting some boundaries, Bellotti bringing corporations into the free speech game, and then along comes Citizens United wanting to air their film. How does the court make sense of all of this?
Well, that's where the real legal fireworks begin. It's a battle of ideas, different justices interpreting the Constitution, weighing precedents, and trying to figure out where to draw the line.
And I imagine those lines can get pretty blurry.
Oh, yeah. The majority opinion in Citizens United really boiled down to this idea that restricting corporate political speech, even if it's about a specific candidate, just because it's a corporation doing the talking,
Right.
they said that crosses the line. That's censorship. That violates the First Amendment.
So they're basically saying a corporation, it's just a group of people.
Right.
And people have free speech rights.
Exactly.
So corporations should too, even when it comes to elections.
In essence, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But you remember how Bellotti focused on issues of general public concern?
Right.
The majority in Citizens United, they took a much broader view. They argued corporations should have the same free speech rights as individuals across the board, even when it comes to spending money on political campaigns.
So no special treatment for corporations, but definitely no less freedom of speech. I'm guessing not everyone on the court was happy about this decision.
You are correct. Not even close.
Mm.
The dissenting opinions, they were deeply concerned.
Yeah.
They saw this as a radical departure from how things had always been done,
Yeah.
and warned of some pretty serious consequences.
What were they most worried about?
Well, they were worried that corporations, with all their money and influence, could basically drown out the voices of everyday citizens.
Okay, so paint me a picture here.
Imagine you're at a town hall meeting and somebody's trying to make their voice heard.
Okay.
But then a corporation walks in with a megaphone
Yeah.
and just starts blasting out their message.
It's a bit of a David and Goliath scenario.
That's exactly what they were afraid of.
Yeah.
They said allowing corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money on political campaigns could totally change the game, giving them way too much influence on elections,
Right.
and in the end on the laws that get passed.
So it becomes less about what the people want and more about what corporations want.
That's the fear.
Yeah.
And it's not even just about one candidate winning or losing.
Right.
It's about the possibility of corporations having the power to shake all the policies that affect us.
With a lot of power concentrated in corporate hands.
And that brings us to another really interesting point that was brought up in the dissenting opinions, especially by Justice Thomas.
Okay, what did Justice Thomas have to say?
He was particularly concerned about this idea of mandatory disclosure laws for political donors,
Okay.
especially in the age of the internet.
So even if the government can't limit what corporations can spend on political speech,
Right.
forcing them to reveal who's funding that speech could still make people think twice about donating in the first place.
Exactly. His argument was that in the age of the internet, putting a donor's name out in the open
Yeah.
could expose them to harassment, boycotts,
Right.
threat. He even brought up examples related to Proposition 8 in California.
Oh, yeah, the ballot proposition dealing with same-sex marriage. That was a really divisive issue.
Incredibly divisive.
Yeah.
And Justice Thomas pointed out that a lot of people who supported Proposition 8 face some serious real-world consequences.
Like what?
People targeted them, boycotted their businesses, just because their names were publicly linked to the cause.
It makes you think, how can we really have free speech if people are afraid to speak their minds because they're worried about what might happen to them?
It's a chilling thought, right?
It is.
And Justice Thomas, he argued that these disclosure requirements, while they might sound good in theory, could actually end up silencing people, especially those who hold minority viewpoints.
So we're back to this balancing act.
Always.
How do we balance the right to free speech with the need to make sure that elections are fair and that everyone feels safe participating in the process?
It's a tough question, and it's one that Citizens United really forces us to confront. I didn't just answer a legal question. It really changed the entire game when it comes to money and politics.
So let's talk about that. How did this one case have such a ripple effect?
Well, by saying that corporations have a First Amendment right to spend money on political speech,
Right.
Citizens United basically removed the barriers that had prevented them from pouring tons of money into elections.
So no more limits on what corporations can spend to support or oppose candidates?
Basically.
Yeah.
And that's when we saw the rise of super PACs.
Ah, yes, super PACs, super spending. It does make you wonder if this is good for democracy or if it actually weakens it.
And that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some people see Citizens United as a victory for free speech.
Okay.
They say corporations shouldn't be silenced just because they're structured differently from individuals.
Right.
But others say it's tilted the playing field way too far in favor of corporations giving them a much bigger voice in our elections than they should have.
It sounds like Citizens United really opened up this Pandora's box of questions about the role of money in politics and what it means for democracy. What's your take on it?
Well, one thing's for sure. It's not just a legal issue. It's a fundamental question about how we want our democracy to work.
Do we want a system where the loudest voice is the one with the most money, or do we want a system where everyone has an equal opportunity to participate regardless of their wealth?
Those are the key questions.
And on that note, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the lasting legacy of Citizens United. What does it mean for us today? So we've talked about how Citizens United really upended campaign finance in the U.S., but it's not like it ended there. This case, it's still making waves today. Every election cycle, it feels like we're dealing with the fallout. What are some of the biggest lasting impacts you've observed?
Well, one of the most immediate consequences was this surge in super PACs. Before Citizens United, corporations and unions, they had limits on how much they could spend directly on elections. But this ruling, it basically opened the floodgates for them to pour unlimited amounts of money into these super PACs, which then could spend freely to support or oppose candidates.
So it's like they found a loophole big enough to drive a truck through.
Pretty much. And the numbers tell the story. In that first election cycle after Citizens United back in 2010, spending by super PACs and other outside groups, it topped $300 million.
Okay.
By 2020, that number had exploded to over $1 billion.
Wow. That's a lot of money being pumped into elections.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, in a system awash in that much cash, does the average person's voice even matter?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's fueled a lot of debate about campaign finance reform. Some people say we've got to find ways to put the brakes on the influence of big money in politics.
Okay.
Whether it's through tougher regulations on spending or finding new ways to make sure everyday citizens' voices are heard.
So maybe it's like trying to find the right volume knob. It's not about silencing anyone.
Right.
It's about making sure no one voice is so overpowering it drowns out all the others.
Exactly. But of course, there are others who say any attempt to regulate campaign spending is dangerous.
Oh, so?
They say it's a slippery slope, that it threatens the First Amendment. They argue we shouldn't be in the business of limiting political speech, no matter who's doing the talking or how much money they're spending.
It's such a tangled web with no easy answers. But I think what's clear is that Citizens United didn't just resolve a legal debate.
Right.
It ignited this fundamental conversation about what kind of democracy we want. Where's the line between free speech and fair elections? How do we make sure our political system is actually representing all of us, not just the wealthy and powerful?
These are the questions we all need to be thinking about. Citizens United, it's like this huge challenge put in front of us.
Yeah.
Figuring out how to balance our principles of free speech with our hopes for a fair and representative democracy.
It's a conversation we can't afford to ignore. It's about way more than just legal precedents or campaign rhetoric.
It is.
It's about shaping the kind of democracy we want for ourselves and for the generations after us.
And it starts with understanding the issues, having these conversations, and demanding better from our elected officials.
As we wrap up our deep dive into Citizens United, I think if there's one thing to take away, it's that this case, as much as it was about the legal ins and outs,
Right.
it really highlights that we all have a part to play in shaping the future of our democracy.
It reminds us that the law isn't set in stone.
Yeah.
It changes and grows as we do.
It's a good reminder for all of us to stay informed, get involved, and never take for granted the power and the responsibility that comes with being citizens in a democracy. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into Citizens United, a case that continues to shape the landscape of American politics.